All right. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, September 1st of 2021. It is finally September. If you are anything like me, that means one thing. It means football season is right around the corner, which is very exciting here. I've mentioned all week that we are planning a full week of NFL content next week. We're all super excited to get that out to you guys. We're planning on doing a unique strategy session to some specific NFL concept every single day of the week next week. So it should be 2 p.m. Eastern every single day in this normal office hour spot. We'll have some other members from the SaberSim team coming on, talking football with you guys, getting you ready for the start of the season. I know everybody is super excited. We've been getting a lot of questions asking when we are going to really be jumping into the football stuff. So it is coming here shortly. Really looking forward to that. In other news, our beta redesign is getting very, very close. I believe we are most likely going to be releasing that out to everybody this week. So very excited about that. If you haven't seen it yet, it's a full visual facelift to the app. Comes with a bunch of highly requested feature requests that we have had. Really, we've had some of these questions coming in all year in some of these requests. So there's a lot packed in there. Min and max exposures before your build, resetting team totals all at once. There's a dark mode. We have support for Yahoo single game slates now. Totally customizable tables and columns. I could just keep going on and on. There is a video on our YouTube page, if you haven't seen it at all, where Andy and I, about a week ago, actually walked through all of the, or some of the changes on the new redesign. So you are welcome to check that out. If you want to see it before it goes live, you still can test it out and try it out at beta.sabersim.com. Log in with your existing SaberSim credentials and check out the redesign while it's still in beta, but it will not be in beta for very much longer here. We are planning on getting a release out here very soon for that. So huge thank you to everybody that participated in that, helped provide some feedback, helped test it out. It made getting everything out and making it work correctly and getting all these new features in there much easier and much quicker for us. So we're super excited about that. But anyway, I will go ahead and just start jumping in here. Thank you to everybody that's tuning in here. I know a couple folks now are jumping in live. If you're watching this or listening to this after, I know we've got a bunch of folks that like to watch or listen to these streams here on their way home from work. That's a common one I hear from people. So welcome to everybody that is watching or listening to the stream in some way or the other. And if this is your first time watching the stream, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. You guys drive the conversation. I get questions in through email, support@sabersim.com. We get questions in live here on the show, and we get questions in our office hours channel on Slack. So I do this show live for a reason. I don't just sit here and record questions that come in from email because I want follow-up questions from you guys. I want you to be a part of the conversation. So as I'm talking about things, feel free to give your thoughts in the chat boxes, ask any questions you guys have, and we will go from there. A handful of questions here to talk about today. I think I've got 3 in my queue. So a couple things to talk about, but if you've got a question for me, you've got something you've been wanting to ask, get it into the chat now. I answer pretty much everything in the order that they come in. And it helps me knowing kind of what questions are ahead of me, what things people want to talk about. Sometimes I can group similar questions together and things like that. So if you got a question, pop it into chat, but we will just go ahead and get started. And actually, I need to go grab this question. This one came in from support. And a really good question here. Let me see if I can dig this one up. Yeah, so this came in through support. And let's go ahead and bring the app up too. And the question says, how come when I use late swap feature, does SaberSim disregard what 4 stacks I want for MLB FanDuel and include every team? I've manually selected the stats I had originally crunched in the original and late swap, but SaberSim still wants to include all teams in late swap. This is a good question, and I actually just realized that this is a specific question about late swap. So when I read this earlier, I thought this was just for the main slate before lock. But it should behave the same whether you're doing a late swap build or not. And the issue here, and I know this is a little bit confusing, so our goal is to make this a little bit clearer to you guys and maybe show or give you some better kind of direction overall on how to use the stacking rule. But say you go in and say that you want 4 stacks of every team, or not every team on the slate. Say you want 4 stacks in every single lineup, and I don't know, just for the sake of this, we're going to remove all the teams that have under like a 4.0 total real quick, just like as a quick example. Maybe this is the way you're doing it. Maybe it isn't. However, you're selecting these teams. Maybe we'll pick a couple extra teams and things like that. Just have some teams in here, right? So what this rule is going to do is it is going to make sure that you have a 4 stack, of course, from at least one of the teams that are in green in every single lineup, right? You're going to have a White Sox stack or a Yankees or Rays or Red Sox or A's or any of these teams, right? There's going to be 4 of those guys in every single lineup. The problem here is that only accounts for 1/2 of the batting order lineup, right? And this is why I totally get why this is confusing, but there's still another 4 batters unaccounted for. And this stack rule does not affect that side whatsoever, right? So you could actually get a lineup that is a White Sox Pittsburgh 4-4 stack, because the rule is going to be satisfied by having a White Sox stack in there, and then it's going to throw in the other stack, right? It's going to pick some other stack based on the way the builder built the lineup. And I totally get why that's confusing. I completely understand that is not very clear with the way this is set up. So we want to make that better for you guys long term. But in the meantime, what I recommend you do as a result of that is add another rule and allow this rule to control your other side of the stack. So you would have to at least have a stacking rule in general here, right? So I would say that you could do like a 4-2 rule. And then you just click the exact same team. So if you do something like this, right? So now it's going to build lineups that have a 4 stack of this team, but it's also going to make sure that the other hitters in the order have at least a 2. That could be a 4-2. It could be a 4-3 or a 4-4 stack for FanDuel. But that other minor stack that's in there or other 4 stack is not going to have the teams that you also don't want showing up here. So that's probably the easiest way to go about doing this. You would have to be willing to... You'd have to be willing to know that you're not going to be playing any 4-1-1-1-1 stacks. You're only going to play 4-2s, 4-3s, 4-4s. I think that's probably fine for like 95% of FanDuel slates anyway. But this is the easiest way to do that, right? So we need a second stacking rule basically to make sure that the teams we don't want showing up as stacks don't show up on the other side of our primary stack. But again, this is a common question. It has come up before. I know I've had the similar question on DraftKings. There's also sometimes some similar questions that come up on NFL, where someone sets like a stack where they say they want a game stack of, I don't know, at least QB 2 and then a run back of 1, and they end up with some other correlations in their lineup that maybe the game stack is different or something like that, right? The point here is that I know that the stacking rules at times can be a little bit confusing. We want to make this a little more clear. We want to make this a little easier for you guys. But in the meantime, that is the easiest way to do that. So can't remember the user that sent me this question here on support, but I will get you a timestamped recording of this question here. If you have any follow-up questions for me here, don't hesitate to reach out. Let me know. Happy to talk about this a little bit more, but this should take care of what you are trying to accomplish here in the meantime. So I'm going to just remove those rules for now and keep us moving forward. But a great question there. And then a question came in from Swifty here. Let's go ahead and jump to this. Similar question to one we had yesterday. And he said, if I'm running lineups in the single entry and 3 max within the 1,000 to 10,000 K entry totals, I'm noticing the sliders don't change on yesterday's slate, at least. Presuming I need 9 lineups in the 3 max contests and 5 single entry contests, does it make sense to run one build with 14 lineups for these contests if the slider is identical? I would say yes. There was a very similar question that came in yesterday. The sliders across the board for single entry and 3 maxes are I found almost always identical. Those contests just play very similarly, right? The field kind of attacks single entries and 3 maxes the same way. There's not a big enough difference between the 1 lineup and the 3 lineup max that it has a big overall effect on strategy. The payout structures for those contests are very similar. So the way we think, the optimal way we think to play those contests is to play very similarly or use the same slider. So in this particular case, I would recommend doing one build of 14 lineups. Part of the reason is to spread out your variance, right? If you've got Part of the reason to use 14 unique lineups is to spread out your variance, so you give yourself as many shots as possible at building a high upside lineup. But secondly, if all these contests are between 1,000 and 10,000 entries, and they're all single maxes and 3 maxes, you can kind of treat this as if it's a bit of like a individual 14 max just for you, right? You're probably equally okay with taking down any of those contests, even if there's subtle differences between the payout structures between them. Winning any of those contests is probably fine, and you can treat it as a bit of a 14 max. Give yourself an opportunity to get a bit more exposure to the teams you want, and go from there. Given that these are the exact same sliders, if you were to break these up into different builds, right, and run a single entry build and then run a 3 max build, you're actually almost probably going to end up playing very similar lineups or very similar approaches, because essentially what you're doing is running one build at the same slider settings, telling it to build 5 lineups, and then running another build and telling it to build 9. Those 2 lineups are going to be very similar. You're probably going to have a very, very tight core of lineups, and I think your better approach is to just build 14 all at once, spread out your risk, give yourself the greatest chance possible of taking one of those contests out. So, but good question. Definitely one that also comes up often, so always happy to talk about that. Let's see. Last question I have here, and again, this is the last question, so I see a few folks watching me live here. If you guys have questions, want something, you have something you want me to talk about, feel free to pop it into chat now. But I'm going to move on to this last question I have here, and this is one from Ryan. And he said, do you see any consistency in moving away from more than 3-man stacks on 12-plus game slates in MLB? I believe I've witnessed enough over the past 2 years to say larger slate 1% lineups are diverse. Curious if anyone at SaberSim has done research. Thanks. Yeah, I would just caution you to be very careful with this line of thinking, right? The correlation component primarily in baseball DFS and in a lot of sports in DFS gives your lineups a better chance of success because the player's individual ceiling outcomes has an impact on other players' ceiling outcomes in the lineup, right? It makes it so you are not just trying to pick 10 individual independent events and assume that you're going to get a 85th percentile outcome in all 10 individual events. That is extremely, extremely hard. It makes it a lot easier to stack and to pick players that are correlated, because then when the outcome that one of those players has a ceiling game comes up, it increases your likelihood of other players in the lineup having that ceiling game. Now, there are always going to be lineups that have no stacks that win big contests, that win small contests, and that place in the top 1%, because with enough lineups, right, 50,000 lineups in your contest, there are going to be non-correlated lineups, non-stacked lineups that place in the top 1% and win those contests sometimes. It can happen. But I would guarantee you that those players playing those contests are probably not profitable long-term. They're probably very fortunate that they hit their win where they did, because it's just exceedingly hard to build high upside lineups without relying on the effect of correlation at all, right? You are trying to basically nail this 10-leg parlay, and if you parlayed those players together, even in just like a typical bet, your odds on that would probably be way higher than what the top prize is in the DFS contest that you're playing, right? And a lot of times, even like on the topic of like parlaying, like apart from the promotions that I know FanDuel has like same game parlays and stuff that they mostly use as like a low limit promotional tactic for people, right? You typically can't parlay correlated players together anyway, because of this reason, right? Because it increases, it's difficult to set odds on that. The chance of one player being successful has an impact on other players being successful, right? That's why we stack. So I would say in general, you are always going to see that sometimes people are going to build high scoring lineups that aren't stacked at all, that aren't good roster constructions. The bigger the contest you're playing, the greater percent chance you have of doing that. I guarantee you at some point this season, someone's going to win the NFL Millie Maker, and they're going to have this lineup that is completely uncorrelated, maybe even negatively correlated, right? Someone plays their QB against the defense, and the defense happens to return like 2 kickoffs for touchdowns or something like that, and the quarterback also throws for 5 touchdowns, and he just hits the absolute nuts at the 3 receiver spots, and nothing's correlated, and it's even negatively correlated, but it's just the total nuts, and it's going to spawn this big conversation on social media and things like that of, is stacking in NFL still a good idea? Is stacking dead? And the answer is always no, stacking's not dead, and yes, you should stack, because it increases your chances of the lineup as a whole succeeding. And that is a fact. There is some idea that if the field begins to stack more than that particular roster construction has the chance of succeeding in that contest, at some point there may be a leverage consideration of, if 5-3 stacks win 10% of the time on DraftKings, but 5-3 stacks are getting played 20% of the time, they may be being overplayed given their win expectation. But we are nowhere close to that point. People still typically, based on the given win rates of a certain stack, winning the slate, those larger stacks are still underplayed in their contests. Compared to their win equity. Couch just said, build negatively correlated lineups to win millions. Yeah, you nailed it. That's the idea, right? That's pretty much all it takes. Just if you build the nuts lineup, you will win every contest, right? That's the easiest way to think about this. No, but seriously, this does come up over and over again, and especially when a high-profile contest gets taken down by a lineup that is not correlated or negatively correlated, it spawns a lot of conversation on DFS social media and things like that. And just be cautious. For the same reason, what I say to people that come in here and say, why didn't I win this night? Or why did I win this night? Right? That's too small of a sample size. I would caution you against looking at any single one contest, or even looking at the top 1% of lineups in contests over a longer period of time and making a decision based on how often stacked lineups win it about whether you should stack or not, right? Because the majority of lineups still, I think, especially like the lower stakes, still aren't stacked at all. If 50% of the lineups in the contest aren't stacked, 50% of the time-ish, maybe 40% of the time-ish, whatever, depending on the quality of the lineups and things like that, right? But a big portion of the time, the unstacked lineups are still going to take the contest down. You're still going to see them at the top. Because this is the only other question I have in my queue here, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this. But guys, if you have any questions for me, feel free to pop them into chat and I will jump over to them. But I just wanted to show you, right? We've talked about this before, and you can use these high smart diversity builds to just kind of show you why lineups that aren't correlated can win, right? If we turn smart diversity at 10, we turn correlation and ownership off. This is basically going to build us a set of optimal lineups using single game sims for every game, right? Basically, what could be the optimal if we played out this slate however many times? I think it'll be 500 here. And you'll see most of these lineups aren't going to be stacked, right? The optimal lineup, literally the mathematical optimal at the end of every slate, is rarely a stacked lineup unless one team just has a spectacular ceiling outcome. And there are multiple teams that fit into the lineup, fit salary constraints, and all have ceiling performances, right? But we're not trying to build optimal lineups. We're trying to beat everybody else in the contest. And we can beat everybody else in the contest by building a correlated lineup that has a greater holistic chance of success across the entire lineup. So we'll just look at this real quick. Right. And you'll see, right? Yeah. So actually there are, like, every once in a while, it just so happens that a 4-2 stack on FanDuel is actually being the mathematical optimal. But there's a bunch of these like 2-2s, 2-2-2-2s, 2-2s. Like if you were this guy that built this lineup, right, where you 2 stacked, what is it? Like I can't even see. Oakland, right? So yeah, you have Sean Murphy and Tony Kemp, right? You have this 7-8 stack of Oakland. Everything else is uncorrelated. If this was the highest scoring lineup, the mathematical optimal, this dude's going to win everything, every single contest on the site. But it doesn't mean this is a good lineup, and it doesn't mean that over a long period of time, a bigger sample size, that these kinds of lineups are going to be successful. They probably aren't. So anyway, a very good question, and I think the themes at play here are important, right? I mean, one, that judging by success in DFS, even over a larger sample size, can be very dangerous. It can be very dangerous because there's so much variance. There's so many random things that can happen that looking to see what is winning, even over the course of an entire MLB baseball season, can frankly be dangerous. Because again, it could be that the bat flip is won 3 weeks straight by a lineup that doesn't have anything bigger than a 4-stack or something like that, right? That kind of thing can happen. So that's one of the themes here. I would say in general, when you're looking for kind of guidance over the changing landscape of DFS, because the landscape does change, and it's important to review your process and keep your eye on things and make adjustments where you can. But I think when you're looking to check your process against somebody else, look at what players that are very good at DFS are doing, regardless of whether or not they're winning or losing in that given moment, right? Go tail Giant Squid and look at what his lineups look like in contests that resemble yours, even if the stakes are different. Look at his roster constructions, right? If all of a sudden there were a bunch of 2 or 3 stacks showing up in Squid's lineups, I would probably change my tune and think that guy's really good. There's something else going on here. That's not what it looks like, though, if you look at his lineups. So I think that's a better overall approach rather than looking at what the random top 1% lineups look like in a contest to determine the way you should be playing. Look at players that we know are good DFS players and see what they're doing. So anyway, I drank a bunch of coffee before the stream here today, so I'm feeling particularly a little talkative, which is good to be on stream, but maybe a little intense here too, talking about this one. But this kind of stuff gets me excited too, because I think there is a lot of, even among very strong DFS players, I think there is this bias that can come into play, especially like if you're particularly struggling or on a downswing, which happens to everybody. It's easy to just start looking at what the winning lineup looks like, or the top 5 lineups, or the top 1% lineups, and start like going crazy, trying to optimize and figure out exactly what those people are doing. And it can be a little dangerous. So anyway, I'll let that one go, but great question, Ryan. Thank you for asking that. And leave that there. So guys, that was the last question I had in my queue here for today. So a few good questions here right off the bat. If anybody else has any other questions for me, perfect. Right on time. Aaron, when will NFL projections be ready for next week? They're ready right now. At least to start playing around with. I would not build your lineups. I wouldn't build your lineups that are ready to just be entered for your contests right now. But if you want to start exploring, go for it. They're up. There is one weird thing that we are tracking down, and I wonder if it is fixed yet. So it's not. Okay, so one weird thing is that we aren't projecting Jacksonville, anybody besides the defense, and the backup QB. So we are looking into that, right? I guess in effect, this means that the projections are not ready, right? Because there's no Jaguars. But it is still here now, over a week before the opening Sunday. So I would say at most right now at this part of the NFL preseason, I think everybody's just building lineups just to see how things are looking and having a little fun with it. So that is available, ready to rock here if you want to start screwing around here. You can see actually all of these test builds are me just like playing around and just getting back in the swing of feeling what it feels like to build NFL lineups. But they should be pretty much ready to start doing some initial builds and things like that. We'll figure out what's going on with the Jacksonville players. I think it's a team abbreviation matching issue from what I've heard. That should be fixed, I would say, probably no later than first thing next week, because I know that people are going to be very excited to start building lineups here, especially as we come out of this weekend, and we want to make sure we have those guys in there. But pretty close here, pretty much ready to roll. So, but Kenneth said, will we have the option to use the Classic and the new SaberSim model? If you are an existing SaberSim subscriber for a short period of time, I don't remember how long we're looking at doing that. It might be a month or so. We are going to allow existing users to go back to the Classic version of the app if you want to. So especially, I know NFL is an exciting time of the year. It's not always necessarily easy to adjust very quickly to the new app. If you have other tools that you're plugging into, Excel spreadsheets, maybe custom things that you've built on your end, not always easy to adjust super fast. So if you're an existing SaberSim subscriber, you will have access to the old version of the app for a short period of time. I think it is going to be about a month, I think. We might end up extending it a little bit longer than that. But if you are a existing user, you'll have this option here that says switch to SaberSim Classic, which will take you back to the old version of the app. If you are a new sign up, right, you will not have this option here to go back, right? We think that the beta is a big improvement. It's launching in what we feel like is actually a better state than even the current app in terms of both features and stability and things like that. It should be faster at this point. So we want people to use the beta. Well, I don't even want to say beta because that after a couple days here, it's just going to be the new app. We want people to use the new app over the classic version sooner rather than later, right? As quickly as possible. But of course, this will be available to you if you are using the beta at an hour before lock on the first NFL Sunday and just finding that it's a little bit too much new for you, you can bump back to the classic version and use that instead. So kind of said, awesome. I'm an advanced sub with the amazing late swap editor. Yeah, that's great. There is actually going to be some news coming out here too about the late swap as well, too. So some exciting news for our subscribers in general. I can't spoil anything beyond that, but leave that there. So, yeah. What else? What other questions do you guys have for me here today? Any other questions? All right, Couch is here. What is a way to approach leverage for NFL? That is, in baseball, you can look at opposing pitcher ownership as a point of leverage for hitters. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there are a few different ways to do this. There's a few different ways I like to think about this. But the first thing that always comes to mind, right, and pitchers, hitters in baseball is like exactly there. The first point that comes into mind is the negative correlation of certain players, right? And it doesn't work as in such a binary way where on like in football, I'm not going to be rushing to play the defense against the chalkiest QB or something like that just to get leverage or vice versa, right? I think there's too many other kind of components. Those players aren't even as negatively correlated, I don't think, typically. It's a decent negative correlation, but it's not the most exciting way to find leverage overall. I think one of the best ways that I've found that you can find a way to introduce a little bit of leverage into your lineups is by looking at negative correlations on the same team, and at least for certain game outcomes, right? So yeah, actually, okay, so this isn't always the case, right? But if we look at a guy like Dalvin Cook, he's actually going to have this negative correlation to both Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, right? There's only so much touchdown equity on an entire team. While there are game outcomes where Dalvin Cook, Justin Jefferson, and Adam Thielen all have ceiling outcomes, they are probably few and far between. And I think you can often find leverage on a certain chalky player by fading that player and instead playing players that stand to gain when that player fails on the same team. So I actually think Dalvin Cook is going to be pretty chalky on week one. I've started to dive into the slate a little bit. I think against Cincinnati, it's probably a game that has and will have a high total going into the week. I think Cincinnati's run defense was terrible last year. I think Cook's going to be popular. I actually think everybody in that game is going to be pretty popular. But I think an interesting idea is still playing in a game environment that is going to be a high-scoring game environment, right? But fading the most popular play and playing players that potentially stand to gain when Cook fails, right? Where maybe it's not the Vikings failing, but maybe Cook fails or doesn't even fail. Maybe he has 80 yards from scrimmage and just isn't the guy that gets the touchdowns, right? Who are the guys that get the touchdowns? They're guys like Jefferson and Thielen. I think you can do similar things in the opposite direction. I think running backs in particular, it's easiest. They stand to get very, very chalky quicker, and it's easier to draw that parallel quickly where it's just, I don't know. It's that easy. I think there is some way you can do this where, like, if there's a certain stack itself that's getting chalky, okay, so I think Green Bay stacks are actually probably going to be pretty chalky week 1, 2. I think Green Bay and New Orleans game stacks are going to be pretty chalky. I think an interesting way to get leverage in that situation, again, is what is a situation, there are many, what is a situation where the Green Bay offense, where the Green Bay Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams stack fails, given their ownership and salary, right? One is they get shut out, and the Saints defense is a good play. But defense, I guess the point here is that, defenses are very variant. That's difficult to predict. What is another situation where Aaron Rodgers and the Davante Adams stack fails? How can we get leverage on that game outcome? Well, it's the situation where Aaron Jones goes off, right? And maybe he scores 3 touchdowns, right? It's those kinds of game outcomes that you're trying to capitalize on. And that doesn't even mean that the Packers fail as an offense, but because of the natural variance of football, it's Aaron Jones's day, and he scores, and the Packers score 28 and Jones has 3 touchdowns, right? And like that, those kinds of game outcomes are in line with even what the public thinks is going to happen from a team total standpoint, right? Or from a SaberSim team total standpoint, or Vegas, or whatever you want to look at, but is a very easy pivot to make from the what's it called? From the actual like play-by-play of the game component. I'll say one other thing, and this is probably a simpler, I'll say 2 other things actually on this, and I think these are a little bit simpler alternatives. One, they're both salary related. One is direct one-to-one salary pivots. I find that this works particularly well in NFL at higher range salaries. If there is one, actually, I like this in NBA too. We'll talk about this more in NBA. If there's one particularly chalky player, especially a good player that's at the higher end of the salary range, or mid to higher salary, right? Doesn't work so good in value situations because sometimes the value is just so good you can't fade it. But let's use a different example here and say that let's use Davante Adams as another example, right? So we have a big difference between Davante Adams and every other wide receiver, and actually almost every other player on the slate right now at the moment. And I think he's probably going to be similarly projected around the industry. By far the best overall wide receiver on the slate. And maybe he is deserving of that. But as we've seen before, even a huge difference in average projection, right, between 2 players playing the same position has a diminished impact relatively at their ceiling outcomes, right? This is he has a 25% over a 25% difference between his average projection and the next best player in Diggs at the average outcome. But at the ceiling outcome, even though it's 8 points here, it is a relatively less difference between his outcome and any other wide receiver ceiling outcome. Because he is 8,300, he is naturally going to fit into a lot of roster constructions where you have room for an $8,300 receiver, which means, at least in what I have experienced here, that means guys at a similar salary range often don't get owned at a level appropriate for their ceiling outcome, right? Nobody doubts that Tyreek Hill has a massive ceiling pretty much anytime he sets foot on a football field. But if Davante Adams is the easy to click guy at 8,300, a lot of times there is a path to just a direct pivot where you have a similar matching roster construction, but nobody plays Tyreek Hill in that spot, right? And in that way, you get these unique roster constructions where if you build that lineup where there's room for the $8,300 receiver, you have a unique combination of players because you're pairing players that are commonly paired with Adams, but using Hill. The other way to think about roster construction is by spending in spots where people are not going to spend. Right. So let's say the common construction, again, we'll start building kind of a lineup here and say that the common construction is a Rodgers. Let's say this is just an example from kind of what I've seen early on in my initial builds, but let's say it's Rodgers and Adams. And maybe it's a run back with Kamara, right? Just for an example. So that's like a common stack. That's what a lot of people are going to build. I think there's going to be other popular stacks, but let's say that's popular, right? So that's going to eat up some salary that is going to probably require you to be a little bit less expensive at some of your other positions. And this is just a quick example, but another position that immediately jumps out to me is tight end, right? If people are going to pay for Kamara and Adams and Rodgers, they're going to find a punt tight end. Okay, so how can we flip that on its head and do something unique from a roster construction standpoint with salary? Well, how are people going to play for Travis Kelce if they're building lineups that look like that in the other lineup? They might find that kind of hard. Actually, Aaron Rodgers is actually a relatively cheaper QB. So maybe if people are paying down a little bit at QB, maybe we start building a lineup with Mahomes and Kelce. And instead of paying up at receiver, we run back with a guy like Odell Beckham or something like that, who's a pretty cheap option. And we're building a lineup that has a very different salary construction standpoint than what the chalk is going to do. Now, I'm talking about this all from the lens of like hand building these lineups, right? And that's obviously not what any of us are going to do using SaberSim, but these can be ways to influence the way then you use your NFL process, right? Maybe you are bumping up, right? One way to think about this would be to look at your receivers, and let's make the assumption, instead of the idea that Devontae Adams is by far the best overall wide receiver on the slate, let's make the assumption that a lot of these guys at this elite top range or similar salary mark are actually projected all at about the same, right? And when we allow the effects of ownership fade to enter into our lineups as well, if we set all of these players at similar projections, right, and one player is much higher owned, you are naturally going to get less of that guy in your lineups, right? That's also going to deflate the exposure that you have to Aaron Rodgers. You could do a similar thing. Let's go back to the very first example with like Dalvin Cook, right? We can say we're still interested in being invested in the Minnesota offense, but let's go ahead and drop Dalvin Cook's projection a little bit, and let's go find Justin Jefferson and Thielen, and just bump these guys up a little bit, right? So we'll give them a little bit of a bump. And this could be kind of a way that you're starting to find some leverage in your lineups by looking at game outcomes, right? Looking at negative correlations within the same team, looking at roster constructions from a salary standpoint, and either differentiating at a certain salary point and just making a one-to-one pivot, or differentiating with your salary construction overall. So those are some ways I like to think about this for NFL. I feel a little bit, it was good to knock some of the rust off there talking about NFL at kind of this deeper level. I think I'm going to have to just continue to like build some lineups here and get back into the swing of NFL a little bit here. But those are definitely some of my strategies of how I like to approach that for NFL. So, but anyway, let's keep it rolling. Kenneth said, it's hard for me to take leverage advice seriously. If everyone is pointing out what's leverage, is it still leverage? How can I navigate this? Yeah, we were actually talking about this internally the other day too, because we have this new leverage column here in, let's see. Oh gosh. Let's go back to baseball. I don't know what all these past builds are. Let's just go back to baseball. But we have this new leverage column in the beta that is a way of describing the leverage you have over the field on a given player. It's just your exposure to that player minus the projected ownership. It shows you basically how much leverage you have over the field on that particular player or under, right? It's a way of visualizing how you're interacting with the field and things like that. It's interesting. I think this is a term that is probably like very widely used in the DFS industry overall. I think it's used differently by different people. I think it's used incorrectly at times. The way I like to ultimately think about it is, if you think about what leverage actually is, right? It is getting a lot more out of little, right? You can use a pulley with a fulcrum and apply a certain amount of force and get more out of it. My physics knowledge is a little dated at this point, but you get more out of it than like what you put into it, or a lever actually with a fulcrum, right? That's what I was thinking of. Literally a leverage, right? Like leverage. You can use a lever and push on one side, and based on where you put that fulcrum, get more out of it on the other side, right? That is kind of, I think, the thinking behind the word. That's the space it has in the DFS industry. And then from there, that's why there's so many different ways to apply that, right? You could say you have leverage on being over the field on even a highly owned player. Even if let's say there's a pitcher that's 50% owned and you have 100% of him, and say he's the highest owned pitcher on the slate. Like, yes, that's still a chalky guy, but you in effect have leverage on that player because in the event that he succeeds, you stand to gain more than the field does, right? That's kind of why it's almost the lever action there of you're going to gain more than the field because you have more lineups with that guy in it. I think I also often think about leverage in the form of probabilities where if a player has a greater percent chance of succeeding, then the field is going to roster that player. Then there is leverage in rostering that player because the field is improperly assessing that probability, right? You get more out of putting that guy into your lineup than your fair share because there's a 20% chance that player is successful and he's only in 10% of the lineups. Right, even if he's not even, depending on how many lineups he's in yours, right? There's leverage there using that player. It's the same deal with roster constructions as we were just talking about before, right? If people are going to pay at a value QB and pay up at running back and wide receiver, then there may be a underestimation of what a pay up at QB and tight end lineup construction's chance of success is in the contest. So overall, I think that's what is trying to be said when people say leverage, right? They're basically making the statement that you can get more out of this player or lineup or construction or whatever than you would expect because of some imbalance, some inefficiency, maybe because you're owning more of the player than the field is, or maybe because the field is underestimating that player's chance or lineup's chance of success. So hopefully that kind of helps. I was talking with Andy the other day about this, and like we had both kind of different definitions and concepts of the way that leverage should be explained. And that opened my eyes a little bit. Like I'm still kind of thinking through some of this stuff and learning more here. So, but that is how I would think about that question. And be cautious, I guess, last point on this, be cautious of people that are using the word leverage where that answer doesn't, or that definition doesn't really make sense, right? Because it does get thrown around, right? Or someone says, does this lineup have leverage or something like that? Just throw it out there, right? Does that even like make sense based on the way we're thinking about this? Is there something about that lineup that gives it additional edge on the field, right? Does that lineup have an increased chance of success given how likely that lineup or that construction is to be played? Like the question kind of just fails. It kind of falls on its face because there's not really any context for that, right? I also don't think it would make sense to say like, does Travis Kelce have leverage, right? That doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? I guess you could work around and say, okay, is Travis Kelce's chance of being in the winning lineup greater than his ownership projection? But you're adding a lot of context there, right? A player doesn't really just have leverage, but lineups can, based on their combination of players, their constructions, right? That kind of thing. So, yeah. Anyway, really good question. I could probably talk about this for like an hour. If anyone has any other thoughts or their opinions on the way that they think about this, please feel free to pop them into chat. I'm going to keep us rolling for now. Ryan said, how much do you use the sports betting tool as a way to find a team to take a stand on? Been using it a lot to take stands on certain teams in showdowns. Yeah, so I actually haven't as much. I think that is something that I would really like to add to my overall process for the way I think about DFS. I do know that Max in particular does some stuff with this. And he actually came on stream on our very first strategy session to talk about this a little bit. So if you, on our YouTube channel, under strategy sessions, all the way to the right now, how to get an edge in sports betting. This video is timestamped. It's mostly about betting. But there's a section, about a 15-minute section at the end of this video, where we talk about using the sports betting tool as a way to influence your DFS process, right? Max is a very skilled DFS player and a very skilled sports bettor, and has some interesting ideas about the ways that you can combine the sports betting app, right? The things you're seeing on the sports betting app with Vegas signals overall, line movements and things like that, to help influence the way you're thinking about your DFS process. So I could attempt to summarize some of his thoughts here on stream, but I think he does so much more eloquently in that video. So I would go check that out. Again, how to get an edge in sports betting. This video is timestamped in the description. And there's a section right at the end. It's about 15 minutes long, where we kind of talk about, or mostly I get the opportunity to listen to Max talk about how he uses the sports betting app in his DFS process, because it is pretty interesting. I do talk about here on stream sometimes how I use some Vegas signals, especially lines that are running away from us, especially in things like baseball. We start a half run over on a certain team, and then over the course of the day, not only does the line move, but it moves away from us, right? That to me is a lot of times a signal that maybe we need to back off that team a little bit and pull down their team projection. That is about as sophisticated as my incorporation of like the sports betting and Vegas side of things gets into my DFS process. So, but yeah, I want to incorporate it more, because I think it can be valuable. While we're on this subject, I do want to just note, because this is actually a very common question that comes in, it is indeed the same sims that power the DFS side as the same sims that power the sports betting side, right? So we're simulating each of these games thousands of times, and like these win percentages are literally the percentage of sims where the team wins the game. This is literally the average amount of runs scored by each team in every single game simulation we have, and they match up over here. And these projections are the average number of projected points across the same sims, DFS points, that the players score in all of the game simulations we have. So have heard that question come in before, where people ask, are the sims the same between the sports betting tool and the DFS tool? And the answer is yes. So the power of the simulations goes through everything we do, really. So, but good question. Another question came in here. I've noticed that increasing a player's projection doesn't always give you more of that player. Yeah, that can absolutely be true. That can be true for a number of reasons, right? First, increasing a player projection, if they have a very high ownership projection or something like that, right? You may not cross the necessary boundary that you need for the builder to think that it makes sense to play that player at their ownership, given your ownership fade projection, right? The other thing that can happen, and I think this one is a little bit more interesting, is that if you are just adjusting player projections, right? So you're just going through and adjusting random player projections, because of the impact of correlation, you can actually you can adjust a player significantly and still not get very much of them, because correlation is high, right? So like, for example, let's say that we just, for whatever reason, had a very good feeling about Jose Ramirez tonight and bumped him up like to 14 or something crazy. Very high increase in projection. We probably are going to get some more Jose Ramirez in our lineups, but because correlation is so high, and the Cleveland batters, the other Cleveland batters' projections have not also increased along with him, the builder is going to probably find that there are still better overall stacks to play than just jamming in Ramirez with a bunch of Cleveland stacks. Now, at his projection at 14, you might just start getting some Cleveland stacks, but that can be a very good reason why you're not getting a player, even if you've bumped his projection, if you haven't appropriately also bumped the overall team that goes along with it. There's also situations where like a player just still isn't a good play at a certain projection, right? A player that is extremely expensive may not even just get enough of a bump if you've increased their projection to get them into your lineups. But for those reasons, we definitely recommend in general that you start, when you're at least experimenting with the projections, by editing the team totals first, because when you do so, say we want to be a little bit more bearish on the Yankees tonight, it has this holistic impact of adjusting the entire team and the team they're playing by looking into our sim data and seeing what the sims look like when the Yankees mean is 5.0 runs instead, right? So the entire Yankees lineup comes down. A lot of the LA bats are actually going to go up a little bit. The LA pitcher is going to have a little bit of a better projection, right? It is a better approach to start with the team totals. On a sport like NFL, this can be a little trickier because especially if you are trying to make a very intentional change to a team without maybe necessarily adjusting the total, right? So we were talking about, for example, the Packers earlier, right? Maybe we're trying to play to the condition where Aaron Jones succeeds and Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams fail, right? It's not entirely clear where to do that here with the team totals. In that particular case, you may just need to bump projections around manually. Maybe we bump these guys down and we bump Aaron Jones up, right? And we're like building lineups for a very specific set of game outcomes. It is entirely possible that you still get a lot of Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams because Devontae Adams is still the third highest projected wide receiver on the slate. Aaron Rodgers is still a top 12 quarterback or so. Those guys are heavily correlated. You can still get lineups with those guys together. You may still not get a ton of Aaron Jones if we feel like there are a lot of other plays at the position and that salary range, for example. I would say what the best advice I can give in general is to just give yourself a chance to kind of take a step back and check what you're doing at every step, right? So like say we did this and we ran this build and we got a little bit less Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams, but we didn't get any Aaron Jones and we're like, it's not working, right? Well, it's a good opportunity to kind of take a step back and look at what you've done, right? In this case, we bumped Aaron Jones's mean projection up to 17. He almost matches Kamara, who's almost 2,000 more than him. We've bumped down Aaron Rodgers to get to now be just maybe the 10th best? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, 10, exactly. We've bumped down Devontae Adams, right? And if we're still getting lineups that look a certain way, it may just be that it makes sense to play some of them, right? If Aaron Jones' projection has been updated to 17 and we're still not getting Aaron Jones in our lineup, we might want to ask ourselves, okay, like, maybe Aaron Jones doesn't make sense because of salary this week or because it's difficult to build lineups where he is correlated in the right way. Things like that, right? So rules of thumb, increasing a player's projection should give you more of them and decreasing a player should give you less of them. But based on that player's ownership projections, right? Your level of ownership fade, their correlation values to other players on the team and your correlation slider and the context of the slate, the way salary and things like that fit together, that's not always perfectly one-to-one. It might not always have the exact impact that you expect. And I actually think that's a strength and that's a value of SaberSim. With a traditional optimizer, you have to navigate all this stuff and be thinking about all this all in your head and kind of like try to put all this together all at once, right? We can actually test. We can say, okay, what if Aaron Jones' projection is 17 and Rodgers is this and Adams is this? Then what are the best lineups to build into 20 max? And we can actually like say that and just do that. And check ourselves against that. But on a traditional optimizer, you have to make these predictions yourself. You say, I want leverage in this way. I want to play more Rodgers or Jones. I want to play less Rodgers and Adams, just as an example again, right? You have to kind of check all that yourself and come up with your exposures to those players, right? You don't have the opportunity to take these play-by-play game sims, look at all these different game outcomes that can take place, look at dynamic correlation values and handle all this, this complicated system that is a NFL DFS slate and figure it out yourself. So anyway, I'm going to keep us rolling here. A few other questions have come in now. One from Corey. Do I need to change nothing on NFL Sims and have plus EV lines if I just added a few projections? Let's see. So there's always value that you can add to the process, always. And we definitely recommend our users do some of their own research, research the players, the games on the slate, consult different sources for your information, and make adjustments to the model in the form of editing projections or editing your exposures as you see fit. However, I don't think there is any other optimizer out there that is better positioned to give you positive EV lineups without doing a single thing. We can look at this here and we'll run just a test build. And I am just going to edit 2 projections very slightly because we need to do that for the DraftKings message. But I'm going to just run a build here. And this is, again, totally default settings. Let's assume contests in NFL are huge. So let's assume you're playing like, I don't know, quarter jukebox or something like that. And you build your 20 lineups and we have touched nothing. There is no other tool out there that's going to build you better lineups, at least from a construction standpoint, than SaberSim, because without doing a thing, it is going to have the appropriate amount of correlation for your lineups. It is going to have the appropriate amount of ownership. And we are going to take advantage of our play-by-play game simulations to actually find players that have upside, play them in your lineups, and also give you the right amount of exposure in your lineups, right? And this is without setting a single rule. This is without touching a thing. So can you add more by doing research and finding good plays? That's difficult to say. Probably you could. But if you have limited time or you aren't exactly sure where to start, there's probably not a better tool out there that's going to do a better job of building you lineups that make sense from a construction standpoint, that have the appropriate amount of ownership for the contest that you're playing than SaberSim. So, anyway, I'm going to keep it rolling. Don said, I sometimes create my own projections in MLB and I adjust team totals. Are the changes sometimes fighting themselves? I would say, okay, so I mean, if on one slate you adjust player projections and then on the next slate you adjust team totals, that's totally fine. If you're doing that on the same slate, yes, they are going to, only actually one of them is going to have an impact. So like, for example, I'm going to use like a very extreme example and say, let's say we set all the Yankees players to 1. Right? Let's just set all these guys to 1 just so you can see it. Or not all of them. We'll just do a few, right? And then if you went in and bumped up this team, we're never going to overwrite your custom player projections. So you can see here, we didn't overwrite the 1s. So I would recommend, and now this is only in this direction, right? So what I would recommend for most people is to go through and make your team total adjustments first and get your team totals in a spot where you want. And then if you want to individually mess with certain players, fine tune from there. So like if you want to, maybe you want to bump up the Yankees, right? We wanted them at like 6, feeling good about the Yankees. But we particularly wanted to bump up a few players that for whatever reason, we feel like we have an edge on. Then you can adjust from here. And that's an easier way to do that. So, but keep in mind that if we go through and adjust like Judge to 12 and Stanton to 11 and Rizzo to 10, these are now custom projections. You've inputted these as custom projections. And again, now if you go back here and drop this down, we're not going to touch it because you inputted them as custom projections. So the main reason why is like, we don't want people getting thrown off. This actually is a small visual bug that shouldn't be red, but we don't want people getting thrown off and inputting custom projections and then overwriting them with the sim or anything like that. So if you enter a custom player projection, we will never overwrite it no matter what. But I'm going to jump real quick to this question because the question that came in before it, I think, is a little bit of a harder one to answer. But Corey asked as a follow-up there, any stacking rules? You don't have to set stacking rules with SaberSim. You can, but you don't have to. And the reason why you don't have to is because we simulate every game play by play, and then we can identify exactly how correlated players are with one another. So when we say Devontae Adams has a 0.46 correlation, that means the mathematical coefficient of correlation between those two players across our thousands of times we've simulated the Packers and Saints game is 0.46. Then when you go to build your lineups, we have these slider settings that set correlation at a certain value based on what contest you say you're playing to us. And we determine this by running thousands of different lineups at every single individual random combination of sliders and setting the defaults at what we find are the highest expected value lineups after building tens of thousands of lineups at every setting when measured against past historical contests. So we will literally see what are the optimal sliders to play for 20 maxes over 50,000 entrants. It makes sense to have correlation valued at a very high level, 8 out of 10. And then you saw in the build we just ran a minute ago, if I can find it, I think it was this one. Without even adding a stacking rule, we get stacks that make sense. And we didn't have to set a stack rule. We get different kinds of stacks, but they are all stacks that generally make sense, right? We have mostly QB plus 2s. We have some QB plus 2s with a run back on the other side. We have 3 QB plus 1s. We could even expand the pool a little bit and see like what some of the next best lineups look like. And we've got this wider variety of different stack types that are all just coming out from our different correlation values. Now, let's say that you said, okay, I'm not ever going to play a QB plus 3 plus 1. I'm never going to play a QB plus 4, right? I'm not going to play this lineup. It's only 2. There's like 2 random lineups that we just don't have a stack at all, but I have to have a stack, right? We allow you to set stacking rules to watch out for those outlier situations. So you can go into stacking here, add a stacking rule, and say, okay, no matter what, you got to play 2 players from the same team. And no, it can't be a running back. QB plus wide receiver or a tight end on the same team, right? Bare minimum. And you know what? I don't like those huge stacks. I didn't like what I was seeing, QB plus 4, QB plus 3. So you can also say, okay, no more than 3 players from the same team. Biggest is a QB plus 2. Now you could run this. We're still going to use correlation. We're still going to look at our correlation values for each player, but now we're not going to build you any stacks that you don't want whatsoever, right? All the lineups are going to have stacks that you want, and you can go from there. So again, no need to set these rules necessarily, but we give you the option if you want that little extra control to build into your lineups, right? You know that you will have a certain type of stack that you want no matter what. Put the stacking rule in, and then let the correlation values and the correlation slider determine which players are correctly correlated enough or appropriately correlated enough to put in your lineups. So now we can go here and see, right? Even if we expand this to look at the whole pool, they're all going to be at least 2 players from the same team and no more than 3 players from the same team. So it all looks good, right? Don't have to worry about which players we're stacking with which players, right? We don't have to worry, well, this guy's a running quarterback and how correlated is he to his wide receivers, right? Josh Allen is 0.3. Well, Josh Allen throws the ball a lot, but let's see if we can find like there. Like this is a good example, right? Kyler Murray, high upside quarterback, but has a lot of his value come in from running the ball, right? His correlations to his receivers are a little bit lower. Same thing. When do I include pass catching running backs in my stack? You don't have to worry about it. Chase Edmonds catches a ton of passes. He's more positively correlated to his quarterback, even a running quarterback, right, than Aaron Rodgers is, right? Not a lot of correlation. Aaron Jones catches some passes, right? But Devontae Adams is a huge target soak. A.J. Dillon catches a few more passes than Jones, right? Football's so complicated. You have guys that fit into different roles regardless of what their positions are. There's quarterbacks that run. There's quarterbacks that don't run at all. There's quarterbacks that run sometimes. There's running backs that catch passes. There's tight ends that don't catch passes. There's all this stuff going on. It's very difficult to know. And setting all these like old rules on a traditional optimizer just sucks. It's so hard to do. What teams do I include pass catching running backs in my stacks? Which teams am I okay playing a quarterback with no pass catchers if they're a running quarterback, right? It takes so long to do that. You don't have to worry about any of that here. I'm so excited for football season to talk about this every week with you guys. But even if you set a stacking rule, which we just did here, to make sure we get the kinds of roster constructions we like, you still get to take advantage of using the correlation data we have to make lineups that make sense. So, and a lot of times there's other like mini correlations that will show up in your lineups here too. Like here's another one, Christian McCaffrey and Jamison Crowder, right? Let's click on these guys. These guys have a correlation, right? Because in an outcome where this game kind of shoots out, both teams have offensive success. They want to keep scoring, right? They got to keep up with the other team. This maybe Panthers Jets isn't likely to be that game, but they do have a correlation when that game value comes out. So you see with the correlation at very high, we get those guys. Now, a lot of people know about this kind of stuff, and they know about these mini stacks or micro game stacks that you can include in your lineups, but it's hard to know how much to put those into your lineups, right? How often do I want that to show up? Again, you don't have to worry about that here because we're going to do it in the amount that makes sense for that game outcome occurring. Another popular one, I wonder if we see it. Here it is. Running back with the defense. Mike Davis actually has a correlation to his defense, right? Teams run the ball more when their defense is performing, when they're ahead in the game. There's a small or a decent sized correlation there. So boom, Mike Davis shows up with a defense stack. That's another stack that people often play. I think people like to play those kinds of stacks. Don't have to worry about how often you're going to do it, or if you need to program a rule, you can just let the builder take care of that for you. So a lot of power here. Very excited to talk more about that as we get into the season. I'm going to jump back to this question here that came in just before. Very hard question to answer. How do I know I'm building positive EV lineups? That's tough. I think that is $1 million question. And if you could very easily calculate the expected value of your lineups before a contest ran, you would win it all, right? That's very hard. The reason why is because even with ownership projections that are very accurate, and even with play-by-play simulations of every single game on the slate, it is very hard to know what a lineup's probability of success is, right? At every single different payout point in the contest, right? So a positive EV lineup, what you are essentially actually saying is that that lineup's overall chance of success, of ending up in the payout positions in the contest is greater than the average lineup's chance of success in those positions, right? So if you're playing a 10-person contest, the average lineup has a 1/10 chance of winning. That has a 1 in 10 chance of getting second. Maybe it's a 10-person contest where the top 3 lineups all have the top 3 lineups all pay out, right? If you have a lineup that has a greater than a 30% chance of being in the top 3, that lineup is theoretically positive EV, right? That's basically the mathematical statement that's being made when someone says this is positive EV, right? But in the actual real world of DFS, it's difficult to calculate your lineup's equity at different payout positions. What's the chance that your lineup comes in first, right? There are ways you can do that. There are calculations you can do, but they're difficult and imperfect. So what often ends up happening, and when most people say that something is positive EV, they are using a sense of intuition, looking at the lineup based on what they know about the sport of DFS. People will say, certain stack types are positive EV, right? In football, stacking a QB with a receiver or 2 receivers and bringing a run back or a game stack from somebody on the other side is often described as positive EV because it means that lineup is correlated. It has a high chance of overall success. And it probably, again, these are typically declarations made with intuition. It probably has a greater % chance of being successful than the average lineup. Similarly with low ownership on certain players, right? If you have low ownership on some guy that has a high chance of success, right? Not a lot of super low ownership in these lineups, but maybe a guy like AJ Brown in your lineup, right, has a high chance of having an upside game and he's going to be low owned. If you actually think that at this point, right? You might be able to say, well, this lineup is positive EV because it has all these low-owned guys that have upside that the field is underestimating. And because we're playing against the field in the contest, right, it has a high chance of success, right? So that's kind of a little bit of like what people are saying when they're looking at positive EV, why it's difficult to calculate the actual probability of your lineup finishing in certain finishing positions and how people often talk about EV. However, on SaberSim, we have made a kind of general attempt to quantify this, and we quantify it in what we call SaberScore. So a traditional optimizer, even if you set all the rules for correlation and ownership sums and caps and all your exposures and things like that, at the end of the day, the optimizer is just going to do what it was made to do, which is to optimize for projected score. It's going to build the highest average projected lineups it can with all your rules taken into account, and then sort them and rank them for you by the overall projected score. We don't do things that way, at least not by default. We instead sort our lineups by SaberScore. And what SaberScore is it is basically using the same sliders that you just used to make your lineups: correlation, ownership fade, and smart diversity. And we actually then reverse it and use the same ideas, those three ideas, to then grade or rate your lineups, right? Because it doesn't make sense to think about correlation and ownership fade and upside and all these things that you have to think about when you're a DFS player, but then to rank and play the lineups that just are the highest average scoring, right? Because we don't care about averages, right? You want to rate your lineups and rank them by the same components that are what you think about when you make the lineups themselves. That's what SaberScore is meant to do. SaberScore is our best estimate at a way of determining what are the highest expected value lineups in your build. So you will see, if we just look back at our 20, say we were just running 20 lineups to play in the main slate, right? The top overall lineup is not always the highest projected score lineup, right? Sometimes it could be not the highest projected score lineup by a lot. In this case, it looks like they are all pretty projected around the same point, but we do have an option to sort by projected score if you just want to see. So yeah, in this case, it looks like all the top lineups are about, it looks like the top SaberScore lineups are also a lot of pretty much the same highest projected score lineups, but that's not always true. So we rate our lineups by how correlated it is, how much ownership it fades, and how much upside it has for the contest that you're playing, and then rank them that way as a way to tell you what the highest expected value lineups you can play are. So hopefully that helps. But Don said, I used to spend hours evaluating players for NFL, but SaberSim takes care of it. I cashed several tournaments last season. Yeah, we hear that kind of thing all the time, right? And the best part about all this is that you get to spend your time on the stuff that's actually fun about DFS. If you want to spend your time researching upside wide receivers by digging into advanced stats and looking at things like air yards and target share and like digging really deep into all that kind of stuff, or if you want to if you like following beat writers, or you really want to follow the beat writers and see who maybe has a chance to get a few extra snaps, or you really like just digging into player exposures and you're building you're maxing out 2 different 150 lineup contests and you're playing 300 total lineups, and you want to make sure your lineups and your exposures are exactly dialed in the way you want. Like all the things that are like pretty fun about DFS that I think are enjoyable. You can spend your time doing that instead of just setting all the crazy stacking rules that you have to for every single team playing on the slate, because you don't have to worry about that, right? Even if you want just like a basic stacking rule, you can set the one that we did here, right? We do have a couple basic stacking rules to make sure we're getting QB +1 or QB +2 or QB +2 with a run back or that kind of thing, right? This took 5 seconds. But from here, we can build a ton of lineups and actually do the things that are fun with DFS. So it really hits home in football. I think baseball, it does a little bit. But like with baseball, if you just set a 5 stacking rule, you're probably on DraftKings, like you're probably done anyway, right? No, that's not the perfect way. Even on a traditional optimizer, no, that's not perfect. There's a lot more things you need to do. But baseball is a little bit easier. NFL is complicated, right? Football is a complicated sport. It plays out in a complicated way. It is difficult to set lineups for all the reasons we've talked about before, right? I'm just deleting some of these builds so they don't crowd me out. But players are correlated in different values. There's running quarterbacks. There's pass catching running backs. There's all kinds of stuff, right? There's red zone target receivers. There's deep threats. It's difficult to know how to set all these rules. You don't have to worry about it. It lets you just have a lot of fun with the game. So anyway, I'm super excited about it. Guys, thank you for everybody that participated here and watched the stream today and asked questions. Again, I say this every single day. You guys make this stream possible, and this stream is for you. So I appreciate you being here. If there's any feedback for me, any questions that you guys have, or any ideas of how we can continue to make this stream better, always feel free to reach out. You can reach out to me in Slack. If you'd like, you can also send us an email, support@sabersim.com, with any feedback you have. But we will be right back at this here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. So looking forward to that. And again, stay tuned for news about the redesign, which we are expecting to launch very soon to the broad SaberSim audience, and a full week of NFL content next week, starting with Monday. So enjoy the slate tonight. Looks like we had 2 baseball games already get canceled due to weather, which is nice. Always prefer that instead of 5 minutes after lock. But enjoy the main slate tonight. Good luck if you are playing the early. I know there's an early slate going on right now, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Take care.